It's The Real News. I'm Dharna Noor. It's presidential debate time again. God help us all. The first Democratic presidential debate is in just a couple of weeks on June 26th. Last week, the Democratic National Committee rejected calls for a climate-focused presidential debate, but the pressure is not off. On Tuesday, Joe Biden became the 15th Democratic presidential hopeful to endorse the proposal. And on Wednesday morning, activists delivered over 200,000 petition signatures to the DNC calling for a climate debate. After rejecting the calls last week, DNC Chairman Tom Perez posted a long tweet thread. He said that he knows climate change is an existential threat, and that while the DNC won't host debates on a single issue area, climate should be discussed in every debate. Joining me to talk about all of this is Lisa Hymas. She's the director of Climate and Energy Program at the media watchdog Media Matters for America. Thank you so much for being here, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.
So the DNC rejected these calls for a climate debate last Wednesday. But that night, again, Tom Perez tweeted, "Frankly, it is my opinion that it is an issue that should have been more prominent during the 2016 cycle." What's your response to that? Your organization found that in 2016, only 1.5% of primary debate questions were actually about climate change.
Yeah, I think the DNC and Tom Perez have been shockingly dismissive of activists' calls and citizens' calls for a climate debate. There have been, as you mentioned, there were more than 200,000 citizens who signed petitions calling for a climate-focused debate. A number of recent polls of likely Democratic primary voters and caucus voters have found them rank climate change as their number one or number two issue that they care about. As you said, there are also 15 presidential candidates who have endorsed the call for a climate debate. So I think there's really good reason to have one. I also think, Tom Perez, in that tweet thread that you mentioned, and then in a follow-up post he wrote on Medium, he basically said that he's relying on the DNC's media partners, so the media organizations that host the debates and provide the moderators. But we've seen these media organizations do a terrible job of covering climate change on a day-to-day basis, of asking climate change questions when they're hosting debates or hosting interviews with candidates. Relying on them is just not the way to get a good, meaningful discussion on climate solutions.
Yeah, again, the first debate is on June 26th, and it'll be hosted by NBC, MSNBC, and Telemundo. How are they at covering climate and the environment? You've done quite a bit of coverage on NBC and MSNBC specifically.
We have. It's a mixed bag. I mean, NBC Nightly News does not do a great job of highlighting it. Chuck Todd, who hosts their Sunday morning political show, Meet the Press, traditionally hasn't done that much on climate change. He's hosted climate deniers and not pushed back against them. He kind of redeemed himself this past December by having a whole episode of the show devoted to climate change with some smart and informed guests. So that was great. But since then, he still hasn't really done much on climate change. And on Meet the Press, when they've had guests on, he has tended to steer the conversation away from climate change, even when political candidates or others bring it up. So I'm not confident that these moderators are going to do a great job.
As you mentioned, there has been an upsurge in climate activism and public engagement in thinking about the climate crisis, though. Has the media responded to that with more coverage at all? I mean, I know that you found that NBC did actually have slightly more climate coverage in 2018 than in 2017, but again, we're talking about, an hour or so.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a little bit of an uptick this year. And part of that is because the Green New Deal has gotten a lot of attention.
Sure.
And so some of the programs have been discussing that. Part of it is because there are presidential candidates who are talking about climate change on the campaign trail and who are making it a priority issue. So sometimes they bring it up during their interviews on TV, on TV networks. And sometimes hosts will ask them about it because they've made an issue. So we're seeing a little bit of improvement, which I'm finding to be encouraging, but they still should be doing a lot more. I mean, frankly, the climate crisis is so dramatic and so wide-reaching that we should be hearing about it every day on major news programs, and we're not.
Yeah, I mean, even Biden now this week joined calls for the climate debate. He's I think many presume will be the DNC's favor. But his climate proposals have been criticized by many green groups because they don't really include a clear plan to quickly move the U.S. off of fossil fuels. So I just want to ask what kinds of climate debate questions we should be pushing for. I mean, what if we get questions about whether or not candidates believe that climate change is human caused, for instance? They'll all say yes, but nothing about their actual plans to combat the crisis in a way that's compatible with what scientists say that we need to do.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, what we don't need are some of the kinds of questions we've seen in the past, like, do you believe climate change is a problem? We need to be way beyond that at this point. And there are a lot of great questions that could be asked of candidates. I mean, we need to know what their plans are to combat the climate crisis and to help communities and states and the whole country adapt as climate is already happening. I mean, there are a couple of great things that could come out of having a dedicated climate debate. One is that it informs voters. It lets them know what candidates' stances are. And, if climate change is important to them, as it increasingly is for a lot of voters, they can see where candidates stand. But it also would force the candidates to study up and come up with good plans. Some of them have released good, detailed plans already. Some of them have not. But if they knew they had to be on stage, for an hour or two defending their plan and describing their plan and comparing it with other candidates' plans, that would really force them to do their homework and to take this issue seriously. Some of them have been taking it seriously so far, but not all of them. Some of them are still just sort of coasting by with sound bites about, yes, we need to take action, and that's not enough at this point.
Sure, and I think we've seen something similar in some media coverage of the climate crisis, sort of generally discussing the fact that people are talking about climate change, but not really dealing with the issue head on. And these mainstream media outlets, of course, receive ad revenue, many of them from the fossil fuel industry. How much impact do you think that has on their unwillingness to seriously cover this climate crisis? And could they possibly get better at covering it in debates and otherwise if they're receiving oil and gas money?
It's hard to say. I mean, a lot of outlets do, as you say, get oil and gas money. And, from the outside, it's difficult to know what sort of influence it has on them. But I do think, even if they're getting the money, the journalists pride themselves on being independent, on not being swayed by that money. They could make the right choices to ask hard questions, to do good segments on these things. And I'm hopeful that we'll see better this year than we have in recent years. But we still do need the journalists to be stepping up.
Sure. And the DNC, I guess. I mean, it's worth noting that last year, after the DNC unanimously prohibited donations from fossil fuel companies, Perez introduced a resolution to reverse that, and that passed. But anyway, so he says the DNC won't have a climate debate because it's a single issue area. What's your response to that? Why does climate change require a whole debate to focus on it specifically? And how could that influence climate action and policy proposals?
I think Perez is kind of falling into a trap that too many people fall into, in thinking that climate change is just a narrow environmental issue. But it's not. It's a massive, wide-ranging set of issues that underlies so many other things. So it's about the economy and how we're going to grow our economy and what kinds of jobs we're going to create and what kinds of industries need to shift. And it's about human health. It's about, it's about agriculture. We can see the Midwest right now, how so many farms are underwater. These are the kinds of issues that we need to be addressing. I mean, climate change touches people's lives, and it underpins the economy of this country in so many different ways. It's really not just a narrow, single environmental issue. So I think if there's any issue area that deserves a single issue debate, it is the climate crisis. Because frankly, if we destroy the climate, like, nothing else is going to matter eventually. This underlies everything else. I mean, that said, I think, maybe we would benefit from other single issue debates on things like healthcare, complicated issues. I mean, the fact is that when you have debates the way they're traditionally done, and you have moderators who just ask a wide range of questions, they tend to waste a lot of time on, like, horse race things, like, who's up and who's down, or you're down in the polls, how do you think you can come back up? That's not relevant. That doesn't tell us anything about where a candidate stands or what they would do. They get asked things like, what would your Secret Service code name be? Which, that's fine if you want to bring a little levity into a debate, but we really need some substance.
Agreed. Especially at such a critical moment when, report after report shows that, we only have a very small window to, reverse this crisis. The consequences could be irreversible quite soon. Many of them we can already see across the globe. Talk about what kinds of actions you expect to see from activists and organizers, and if you have hope that, any of these calls could be actually heeded.
I continue to be hopeful. As you mentioned, a number of activists delivered petition signatures to DNC headquarters today, and they're not going to let up. They're going to keep pushing for a debate. You're going to keep hearing citizen activists all over the country pushing for a debate. The candidates who care about this are going to continue calling for one. So I'm hopeful that the DNC might change its mind. One of the good signs is, it's the DNC leadership, Tom Perez's office, that appears to have made this decision, but many DNC members are not pleased with it. And so we've seen at least 50 of them sign on to a letter saying, hey, we need to reconsider this decision. And they can work within the DNC. They might be able to help push the idea of a climate debate forward. In the meantime, as you say, the first debate's coming up in 2 weeks. And so activists are going to be calling on the moderators of that debate. Okay, Tom Perez said you're going to put climate change front and center and you're going to ask questions about it. Are you really going to do it? People can right now submit their own questions on the NBC website if they want to suggest questions on, related to climate change and how candidates would address the climate crisis. So do that, tweet at the moderators. Hopefully they'll understand that this is something that the public wants to hear about.
See if these calls are heeded, if there are more climate questions or maybe even a climate debate of some sort. I'd love to talk to you again. Viewers, for more like this, check out our latest climate documentary, How the Mainstream Media Ignores the Climate Change Crisis, produced by Bruce Livesey, which Lisa is also in. And yeah, Lisa, we hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much. It was great to talk with you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.